The dust swirled like specters in the early morning light as Daniel Vaughn made his way up the gently sloping hill, his weathered boots crunching against the parched earth of New Mexico territory. It was 1875, and for 365 days straight, he had walked this same path to the lone grave that sat beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient cottonwood tree. Daniel was tall and lean, hardened by years of ranch work and heartbreak. His once vibrant blue eyes now carried the permanent shadow of loss, and his face tanned and lined from years under the southwestern sun rarely found reason to smile. At 32, he'd already lived what felt like several lifetimes. The first as a hopeful young man, the second as a devoted husband, and now this third existence as a hollow shell of himself, mechanically moving through each day with only one true purpose: visiting Sarah. Every morning since they'd laid her in the ground, he would rise before dawn, saddle his chestnut mare, and ride the mile from his small ranch to this hillside that overlooked the entire valley. Some days he brought wildflowers, other days he brought only his grief. But he always came, and he always stayed for exactly 1 hour before returning to the endless work that kept his body occupied while his mind remained tethered to the past. Today marked 1 year since typhoid had taken Sarah, stealing her away after only 4 years of marriage. Daniel dismounted, tethered his horse to a low branch, and approached the wooden cross that bore her name. He knelt in the dirt, removed his hat, and closed his eyes. No words came, they rarely did anymore, but the silence spoke volumes of his devotion. He was so absorbed in his ritual that he didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats until they were nearly upon him. His hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip, a habit formed in a land where danger could arrive without warning. "I'm sorry," came a soft female voice. "I didn't mean to intrude." Daniel turned to see a woman atop a palomino, her auburn hair catching the morning light beneath a practical wide-brimmed hat. She wore a riding skirt and jacket of deep blue, dusty from travel but clearly of quality make. "This is private property, madam," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The woman nodded, her green eyes showing genuine remorse. "I know.
I'm Madeline Grayson.
I've purchased the Davidson place just down in the valley." She gestured toward a distant collection of buildings. "I was exploring the boundaries, and didn't realize. I'll leave you be." Daniel nodded curtly and turned back to the grave. He expected to hear her right away, but instead, after a moment of hesitation, he heard her dismount. From the corner of his eye, he watched as she removed her hat and stood a respectful distance away, her head bowed slightly. Minutes passed in silence. Daniel found himself distracted by her presence, but couldn't bring himself to send her away. There was something oddly comforting about not being alone in his grief for once. When his hour was up, he rose stiffly to his feet, replaced his hat, and turned to face her properly. "Sarah," he said, gesturing to the grave. "My wife. 1 year today." Madeline's eyes softened with understanding. "I'm truly sorry for your intrusion and your loss, Mr.
Vaughn.
Daniel Vaughn." "Mr. Vaughn." She nodded, then hesitated before adding, "I lost my husband 2 years ago, back in Boston." Daniel studied her face, seeing the familiar shadows of grief he recognized from his own reflection. He offered no platitudes, he'd heard enough of those to last a lifetime, just a slight nod of acknowledgement. "Good day, Mrs. Grayson," he said, mounting his horse. "Good day, Mr. Vaughn." As he rode back toward his ranch, Daniel found himself thinking about the woman and her quiet presence. It had been the first time in a year that his morning ritual had been interrupted, yet he wasn't as angry as he would have expected. Instead, he felt an odd sense of connection, a brief moment when the weight of his solitude had been imperceptibly lighter. The next morning, Daniel followed his ritual as always. As he crested the hill, he half expected to see Madeline Grayson again, but the hillside was empty save for the cottonwood and Sarah's grave. He felt a peculiar disappointment that surprised him, then immediately felt guilty for it. He knelt at the grave, placed a bunch of wildflowers he'd gathered along the way, and began his silent communion with memories. Halfway through his vigil, he heard hoofbeats approaching. Without turning, he knew it was her. She didn't speak this time, just dismounted and stood at the same respectful distance as before. When Daniel's hour was complete, he stood, nodded to her, and rode away. This pattern continued for a week. Each day, Madeline would arrive partway through his visit, stand in silence, and then they would part with minimal words exchanged. On the 8th day, as Daniel prepared to leave, he finally asked the question that had been building within him. "Why do you come here, Mrs. Grayson?" She seemed startled by his direct question after so many days of near silence. "I suppose. It feels right to honor your devotion. And perhaps I understand something of what brings you here each day." Daniel nodded slowly. "Will you be riding back toward town?" "Yes." "I could accompany you part of the way," he offered, surprising himself. A small smile touched her lips. "I'd appreciate that, Mr. Vaughn." They rode side by side down the hill, an awkward but not uncomfortable silence between them. Daniel found himself stealing glances at her profile. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 28 or 29, with a quiet dignity to her bearing. "The Davidson place needs work," he commented as they approached the fork in the road where they would part ways. "Yes, it does," she agreed. "But that's why I could afford it." "You're planning to run it yourself?" he asked, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. Madeline's chin lifted slightly. "I am. My father raised me on a farm in Vermont before we moved to Boston when I married. I know more about land management than most would guess." Daniel nodded, chastened by her gentle rebuke. "It's rough country for anyone alone." "Yes," she said simply, and he heard in that single word an acknowledgement of both the physical challenges and the deeper solitude they both understood. At the fork they paused. "Good day, Mrs. Grayson." "Until tomorrow, Mr. Vaughn." Daniel watched her ride toward her property before turning his mare toward his own ranch. For the first time in a year, he found himself thinking about something other than his loss. He was thinking about the work that would face a woman alone on a rundown ranch, and what that might mean for her chances of success in this unforgiving territory. The next morning, after his visit with Sarah, Daniel surprised himself again by asking, "Have you hired hands for your place yet?" Madeline shook her head. "I've been inquiring in town, but good help seems scarce." "Folk around here are wary of outsiders," Daniel explained. "Especially," he stopped himself. "Especially a woman alone," she finished for him. "Yes, I've gathered that much. I know some reliable men," he offered. "I could put in a word." Gratitude flickered across her face. "That would be very kind." As they parted ways that day, Daniel found himself riding not to his ranch, but toward town. He stopped at the general store, where most local men gathered when seeking work. "Josiah," he nodded to the storekeeper, a man he'd known for nearly a decade. "Daniel Vaughn," Josiah replied with evident surprise. "Rare to see you in town these days." "The Grayson woman who bought the Davidson place, she needs hands." Josiah raised his eyebrows. "Heard she was from back east. City folk don't usually last long out here." "She grew up farming in Vermont," Daniel corrected him. "She knows land. Just needs good men who won't try to take advantage." Josiah studied Daniel's face carefully. "I'll spread the word to the right sort. Thomas Miller and his boy are looking for work since the drought took their place. Good, honest folk." Daniel nodded his thanks and turned to leave. "Daniel," Josiah called after him. "Good to see you taking an interest again." "In anything." Daniel didn't reply, but the words followed him as he rode home. The next morning, he arrived at Sarah's grave to find Madeline already there, kneeling beside the wooden cross, carefully removing weeds that had begun to sprout around its base. She looked up at his approach, her expression uncertain. "I hope you don't mind," she said quickly. "It seemed I wanted to help somehow. Daniel felt a complex wave of emotions, protectiveness of Sarah's resting place, gratitude for the gesture, and a strange warmth at seeing someone else care for his wife's memory. "Thank you," he said simply. They stood together in the now familiar silence until Daniel spoke again. "Thomas Miller and his son should be calling on you today about work. They're good men." Madeline's face brightened.
Thank you, Daniel.
"That's very kind." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the sound of it in her gentle voice stirred something long dormant within him. Over the next few weeks, their morning meetings continued, but their conversations gradually lengthened. Daniel learned that Madeline had been married to a banker who died suddenly of heart failure, leaving her with enough money to start fresh but no ties to hold her in Boston. She had no children, a sorrow they shared, as Sarah had miscarried twice during their brief marriage. "Why New Mexico territory?" he asked one morning as they rode side by side. "I wanted somewhere completely different," she admitted. "Somewhere with wide open spaces and room to breathe." Boston felt suffocating after James died. Everyone watching, pitying, waiting for me to either collapse or remarry. Daniel understood that sentiment all too well. The townspeople had treated him similarly, though with the rough sympathy of the frontier rather than the polite concern of Boston society. "And you," she asked, "have you always been here?" "Came west after the war," he said. "Fought for the Union. Couldn't settle back home in Missouri afterward. Too many ghosts." He rarely spoke of those days, but something about Madeline made it easier.
Met Sarah in Santa Fe.
She was teaching at the new school there. Convinced her to marry me and come start a ranch. "She must have loved you very much," Madeline observed. "I wasn't worth it," he said quietly. Couldn't keep her safe when it mattered. Madeline reined her horse to a stop, forcing him to pause as well. "Typhoid isn't something anyone can fight, Daniel. You know that." He looked away, unwilling to accept the absolution she offered. "Should have gotten the doctor sooner. Should have blamed yourself every day since," she finished gently. "I understand. I did the same. If I'd noticed James was working too hard, if I'd insisted he see a doctor about his fatigue." For the first time, Daniel saw the tears she normally kept carefully controlled. Something protective stirred within him, and he reached across the space between their horses to briefly touch her hand. "It wasn't your fault either," he said. A sad smile crossed her face. "Perhaps we both need to learn to believe that." As spring turned to summer, Daniel found himself looking forward to their daily meetings. Sometimes, after their visit to the grave, he would ride with Madeline to her ranch, offering advice on repairs or livestock. The place was slowly transforming under her determined efforts and the capable work of the Miller men. One hot July morning, Daniel arrived at the grave to find Madeline already there, but something was clearly wrong. Her shoulders were hunched, and even from a distance, he could tell she'd been crying. He dismounted quickly and approached. "Madeline, what's happened?" She wiped hastily at her face. "It's nothing. Just it would have been my wedding anniversary today. 10 years. She attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Some days the grief just catches you unaware, doesn't it?" Without thinking, Daniel sat beside her and put his arm around her shoulders. She stiffened momentarily, then leaned into his embrace, her body shaking with silent tears. They sat like that for a long time, the morning sun climbing higher as Madeline's grief gradually subsided. "I'm sorry," she said finally, straightening and wiping her face. "I didn't come here to burden you with my sorrows." "You've shared mine every day for months," he reminded her. "It seems only fair." She looked up at him then, really looked at him, and Daniel felt something shift between them, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been quietly growing all this time. "Would you come for supper tonight?" she asked suddenly. "I've been practicing with those cooking lessons Mrs. Miller's been giving me." Daniel hesitated only briefly. "I'd like that." That evening, as Daniel approached Madeline's ranch, He felt a nervousness he hadn't experienced in years. He'd bathed thoroughly, trimmed his beard, and put on his one good shirt. He even wore the silver bolo tie Sarah had given him for their first anniversary, something he hadn't been able to look at, let alone wear, since her death. Madeline greeted him at the door, wearing a simple but pretty dress of deep green that complemented her eyes. Her hair was down, falling in waves past her shoulders, and Daniel found himself momentarily speechless at the sight. "You came," she said, sounding almost surprised. "Said I would," he replied, removing his hat as he stepped inside. The small house was transformed from the dusty, abandoned shell it had been when she purchased it. Chintz curtains hung at the windows, a colorful rag rug covered the center of the plank floor, and bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that spoke of Madeline's Eastern education. Supper was simple fried chicken, biscuits, and greens from her newly established garden, but it was the best meal Daniel had eaten in longer than he could remember. They talked easily, sharing stories of their lives before grief had reshaped them. Daniel found himself laughing at Madeline's tale of her first disastrous attempt at making soap, something he wouldn't have believed possible just months ago. As the evening drew to a close, Daniel helped her clear the dishes, their hands occasionally brushing in a way that sent unexpected warmth through him, followed immediately by a sharp pang of guilt. Madeline seemed to sense his conflict. As they stood on her porch in the gathering twilight, she turned to him with serious eyes. "Daniel, I want you to know that I understand what Sarah means to you." "I would never presume to," she stopped, searching for the right words. "What I mean to say is that I value our friendship, and I don't expect anything more than you're ready to give." Daniel looked out at the darkening landscape, the distant mountains turning purple against the fading light. "I promised her forever," he said quietly. "I know," Madeline replied. "James and I made the same promise. But Daniel..." She touched his arm gently. "Forever doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes shape." He thought about that all the way home and through the long night that followed. When he arrived at Sarah's grave the next morning, his heart was heavy with confusion. For the first time, he spoke aloud during his vigil. "I miss you every day," he told the silent cross. "That hasn't changed. It won't ever change." He swallowed hard. "But I think you'd want me to live again, Sarah. You always said I was too serious, too locked inside myself. You'd probably tell me I'm being a fool right now." A slight breeze stirred the branches of the cottonwood, sending dappled shadows dancing across the grave. Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the warm wind against his face like a caress. When he opened them again, Madeline was approaching on horseback. Seeing her now, with the morning sun illuminating her face, Daniel felt a certainty settle over him. Sarah would always be his first love, the woman who had taught him how to open his heart. But perhaps there was room in that heart for something new, not replacing what was lost, but growing alongside it. As summer turned to autumn, Daniel and Madeline's relationship deepened. They still met each morning at Sarah's grave, honoring the ritual that had brought them together, but now they often spent evenings together as well. Sometimes at her ranch, where Daniel helped with repairs and improvements, sometimes at his place, where Madeline's touch had begun to soften the stark bachelor existence he'd been living. The townspeople noticed the change in both of them. Gossip inevitably followed, but for the most part it was kind. Everyone had seen Daniel's devoted grief. No one could begrudge him finding some happiness again. "You should marry her," Josiah said bluntly one day when Daniel was in town for supplies. "Women like that won't wait forever." Daniel frowned. "It's not that simple." "Seems simple enough to me," the storekeeper replied. "You're alive, Daniel. Start acting like it." The words stayed with him, echoing Madeline's gentle suggestion that it was time to truly live again. But something held him back, a final barrier of guilt and uncertainty that he couldn't quite overcome. The first snow of winter came early that year, a light dusting that transformed the landscape overnight. Daniel rode to Sarah's grave as always, his mare's hooves crunching through the thin crust of white. Madeline was already there, wrapped in a heavy coat, her breath forming clouds in the crisp air. As he approached, he saw she was placing something at the base of the cross, a small, carved wooden box. "What's that?" he asked, dismounting. Madeline looked up, her cheeks pink from the cold. "It's a memory box," she explained. "In Boston, some people make them to hold keepsakes of those they've lost." She hesitated. "I thought, perhaps you might want to put something of Sarah's inside. To keep her close, but also to let her rest," Daniel finished, understanding immediately. Madeline nodded. "I've made one for James too," she added softly. Daniel knelt beside the box, running his fingers over the intricate carvings of wildflowers that decorated its surface. With trembling hands, he reached into his pocket and withdrew the gold locket that had been Sarah's most treasured possession, the one thing he'd kept with him every day since her death. Inside were miniature portraits of them both, painted during happier times. He looked at Sarah's smiling face one last time, then gently placed the locket in the box and closed the lid. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Madeline's eyes shone with unshed tears. "You're welcome." They stood together in the snow, hands clasped, in a silence that felt different from all those that had come before, not heavy with grief, but peaceful with acceptance. That evening, as they sat before the fire in Daniel's cabin, he finally found the courage to speak the words that had been building inside him. "I loved Sarah with everything I had," he began. "And part of me always will." Madeline nodded, her eyes steady on his face. "As it should be. But I've come to realize that loving her memory doesn't mean I can't love again in the present." He took her hands in his. "I love you, Madeline. Not instead of her, but in a way that honors what she taught me about opening my heart." Tears spilled down Madeline's cheeks. "I love you too, Daniel. And I think James would be happy for me. For us." "Sarah too," Daniel agreed. "She always said I was too serious. She'd probably be laughing right now at how long it's taken me to see what's right in front of me." Madeline smiled through her tears. "Then let's not waste any more time." They were married in the spring, when the hillside where Sarah rested was carpeted with wildflowers. It was a small ceremony, attended by the handful of friends they'd made and strengthened during their time together. Afterward, they walked hand in hand to Sarah's grave, where Daniel placed a bouquet of the same wildflowers that had adorned their wedding. "Thank you," he whispered to the quiet cross, "for everything you gave me, and for helping me find my way to her." Madeline squeezed his hand, her new wedding ring catching the sunlight. "Ready?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded, and together they walked down the hill toward their future, the past not forgotten but finally at peace. Their life together blossomed like the land around them. The two ranches gradually merged into one thriving operation, with Daniel's cattle complementing Madeline's expanding vegetable gardens and fruit orchards. They became known for their generosity, often helping neighbors through hard times and taking in the occasional orphan or drifter who needed work and a fresh start. Daniel still visited Sarah's grave, though not every day. Sometimes Madeline came with him. Sometimes he went alone. It became not a ritual of grief, but a moment of grateful remembrance, acknowledging the love that had shaped him into the man who could love again. In their third year of marriage, Madeline gave birth to twins, a boy they named James, after her first husband, and a girl they called Sarah, honoring the woman whose grave had brought them together. Daniel wept when he held them for the first time, overwhelmed by the fullness of his heart and the unexpected gifts life had given him after he thought all joy was lost. As the children grew, Daniel would sometimes take them to the hillside, telling them stories about the brave, kind woman who rested beneath the cottonwood tree. "She helped bring your mother and me together," he would explain. Sometimes love finds us in the most unexpected ways. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work was done, Daniel and Madeline would sit on their porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and purple. In those moments, with her head resting against his shoulder and their hands intertwined, Daniel knew a peace he had once thought impossible. "Do you ever regret it?" Madeline asked him once. "Coming to my silence that first day?" Daniel smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Never. That silence saved me. You saved me." "We saved each other," she corrected gently. And in the soft glow of twilight, surrounded by the life they had built together, Daniel knew it was true. They had each walked through the darkest valleys of grief alone, but they had found their way back to joy together, honoring the past while embracing the present, and looking with hope toward all the tomorrows still to come.